Everybody's like, well, the military's not really real life. I'm telling you, it's the same freaking thing. When you're spending your own dollars and your own dimes, right, those lessons stick with you, right? They stick way harder. Emotional learnings are way better than intellectual or book learnings. The answer is we didn't know immediately what we were going to do, right? We're like, okay, we need to come up with another plan, right? There's 1,000 ways to make money. Let's find a different one.
Welcome to Marketing from the Edge podcast. I'm Jon Alexander. I've directly generated over $200 million in net revenue over the last 5 years through innovative marketing and a numbers-first strategy. Join with me is my dad. Jon Alexander has become the go-to expert in the direct marketing field, generating over $1.5 billion in revenue over the last 5 years. Sought by both board of directors and nine-figure businesses, he is an owner/founder of Centurion Publishing and is on the journey of growing this brand new business from 0 to 100 million in annual revenue. Today, for the first time and probably the last time, I'm interviewing my dad, Jon Alexander, on his secret to success in marketing. How he went from living in a small town of less than 2,000 people with no advantages to building one of the most successful direct marketing businesses ever on the planet. So my kids watch a bunch of the Discovery Plus about science and technology and all that stuff. And we were watching this guy build a real life Iron Man suit, right? Bulletproof, bomb-proof, all that stuff. But it was really interesting, really cool. And my youngest was asking a bunch of cool questions. And then later on, I ended up watching this interview with the CEO of Shopify, right? And it's valued at 100 billion. So I was watching the interview and I saw a comment come up. I had to write it down. The one time some random guy on the internet says something profound. It said, the fact you can listen to the thoughts of billionaires and put them in your own head for free is insane. Yeah, you're listening to a guy whose valuation is 100 billion, but how he sees his business, what he thinks of the market, what he is paying attention to. You didn't have that kind of access not too long ago.
Yeah, it's so true. So much of it, you ended up with, guys would retire and then they'd write a book, right? That was the thing. Everybody ended up writing a book, but it was always based on 20 or 30 years ago knowledge in many cases. And now that the way the world moves and as fast as it moves and everything, you want to know what Mark Cuban's thinking today, not 10 years from now when he writes a book.
Exactly.
I mean, even magazines now are struggling just because their news is a week old or 2 weeks old or a month old,
right?
Compared to the instantaneous world that we're in.
Their speed to market is
exactly
not there. Obviously, one thing we're big about here, and the goal for this podcast really is to bridge the gap from where you are today to where you want to be.
Exactly.
Right. And we both have used this term of buying speed, right? Now, luckily, the cost is free. It's your time. Right. So the cost is whatever you value your time at. But the goal is to go from where you're at today, wherever that may be, to get to where you want to be. And I think some of the things we're going to talk about today are going to really help people. Maybe if they're not sure where even they want to be, I think it'll help them kind of get an idea of, hey, that sounds cool, or that's interesting, or that's something worth aiming at. So, I'm going to ask you questions because there's stuff even I don't know, right? There's stories that I hear that I'm like, what? I had no idea you did that, or that was a thing. So for me, I kind of want to cover 3 sections here, right? I want to focus on how you started, right? Kind of the zero to hero story. I'm a big fan of Hercules. Then move into where you're at today. You've had all this success. What do you aim at now? What do you look at? How do you think about marketing? And then I think the third thing is for everyone at home, how could they do it faster? What are those big takeaways? What are the hard lessons that you wish you didn't have to learn, or you wish someone had just gave you that soundbite where you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I won't go do that thing. And the big thing is, if we can, almost build out a roadmap, right? Of if you're here and I had to figure it all out again, here's what I would do or what I wouldn't do. And I don't think it has to be super in the weeds, but more big picture, right? I would go spend my time doing this.
I mean, this clearly is my least favorite subject because I'm a we guy, not an I guy, right? I'd rather talk about anything other than myself. But I understand it's helpful, and I understand it's helpful to guys. And so I have no problem going through it. But this is probably the only time we'll do this in this podcast. because I'd much rather focus on current event things and things that are going on now and things that people can actually implement and do it, as opposed to, how I got started and who the hell I am. But I understand it's important.
Well, it's interesting. Like your story is genuinely interesting, and it's like pulling teeth to get you to share it. But, when you do, there's always a nugget in there. The first real question I have is, how did you find direct response marketing? Like, what about it stuck out to you, or did you, stumble on it on accident almost?
It's wild because direct response marketing as a term, wasn't widely understood until Facebook marketing came around. You didn't really have a whole lot of direct response marketers. You had guys like Halbert and Carlton and Dan Kennedy talking about it, right? And teaching people how to do it. But most of the time, if you talked about marketing, 98% of the people assumed you were talking about brand building, right? Coca-Cola marketing.
Well, there's direct mail days, right?
Yeah.
But it was, it's kind of the first input is how many did I send, and the last input, which is how many people bought. Yeah,
which really was the original direct response days, right? Because typically, if you go back into the 80s when I got started, right? You go back into that time period, there weren't credit card machines. There was no way to order online, obviously. There was no internet the way we know it. So in order to get a response from somebody, you didn't sell Coca-Cola through the mail, right? Like, that's why branding was such a big deal. And almost all the advertising dollars were spent on branding is you needed to convince somebody based on a commercial that the big difference between brand and direct response is how do you respond, right? Which is obvious. But brand building, for the most part, right? You have to watch it over and over again. And then you decide when you go to the grocery store, you get to choose between Coke and Pepsi. You've seen 55 freaking Coke commercials and 2 Pepsi commercials, and Coke stuck in your head. You buy a Coke, right? That's what brand building is all about.
Yeah, it's associative relationship.
Exactly.
It's very vague.
The reason why they created Ronald McDonald, right? A circus character to represent it, right? And all those things have to occur because the time to purchase is disassociated from when the message is, right? Direct response, the time to purchase is associated right to the message.
Right.
And so that's why it's much more actionable. It's much more accountable. It's, hey, can I get somebody to take action? Can I go through the direct response techniques of persuasion and all those type things, right?
Right.
Reciprocity and all those things that trigger urgency and regret and emotions, right? It's much more emotion feeling based. So when I got started in the 80s, I actually started back in the day, right? If you go all the way back to the beginning.
Marty McFly days.
I'm back. Yeah, Marty McFly. Yeah, before Marty McFly, actually. Back in the day, my grandpa used to buy the National Enquirer every time he went to the checkout stand at the grocery store. And I'm like 12, 13 years old. And, National Enquirer is like, adult has gorilla baby, and they got a picture of a gorilla baby coming out. Not like it was TMZ before TMZ, basically.
Right.
It was by far the number one circulated newspaper in America, right? By far. Right? More people bought the National Enquirer and hit it than anything else because they don't want anybody to know they were reading about aliens and space invaders. Yeah. But in the back of the National Enquirer was always direct response ads. And I would read through the direct response ads or read through the ads in the back there. And it's like the old Popular Science magazines. You could sit away for here's how to make a jetpack and all that stuff, right? And I remember specifically, you'd usually give $1, $1.25, or whatever, some self-addressed stamped envelope. And basically you paid to get the mailing piece to sell you, right? That's in essence what they were. I didn't know that. I'm 13 years old.
Yeah.
But I would get these mailing pieces back in, and I was just fascinated by what they did, right? I'm like, somebody actually took an idea, put it into print, and turned it into money, right? Because that's in essence what they're doing, right? I grew up, my mom and dad worked at the factory.
Yeah.
You took your hours, converted into labor. Your labor then turned into dollars.
Yeah.
And there was a direct
it's an
response.
Input, output.
Yes, exactly. And I'm like, wait a second. You can take your idea, put it down on paper, and people will pay you cash for it. It was for a 13-year-old kid that knew nothing but go out and pull weeds for a quarter, right?
Yeah.
It just blew me away. And so I'd send away for all these things. And then I remember, in 1986, there was a Tax Reform Act went through in 1986. And my uncle was a real estate agent. And he had a buddy that was a real estate agent. And their business literally shut down overnight.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they changed some of the laws. And in essence, what it meant was doctors and dentists and everybody else who used to take their entire active income, and they would then lose that much money in passive income, and they could wash out their income and had to claim no income. So if you made $300,000 as a doctor, if you went and bought a building that on paper lost $300,000, you actually claimed zero in taxes. It was genius, right? Which is why they killed it. But what it did is it killed real estate in general. And I remember my uncle was super in debt and so was his buddy. And we lived in a town, Prescott, same place you graduated high school, right? It was a retirement town. And people would write into the Chamber of Commerce to get information. Again, this is all pre-internet days, right?
Yeah.
So you would write into the Chamber of Commerce and say, hey, I'm interested in the town. Can I get a packet of information? And that would be available to anybody that was a chamber member. So they basically told you like, hey, by the way, I'm interested in moving to your town. And so, of course, a bunch of real estate agents went after it. But what we did was we did it differently. So first of all, we joined the chamber. And specifically, they joined the chamber because I'm 15 years old.
Yeah.
Right. So they joined the chamber and started reading through all these letters. I would go down to the Chamber of Commerce and literally handwrite all the addresses on paper because that's what you had to do, right? You check in. They give you all the stack of mail from that week. You handwrite all the
automated machine to
automated
handwrite.
Machine, all these genius ideas you're trying to think of. And what we did is we sat down after going through enough of these papers and you understood exactly what people were after. And so then we sat down and wrote down literally a one-page sales letter. Me and my uncle did. We wrote a one-page sales letter that touched on the points on why somebody should do business with them and move here.
Right.
And send it out. And within 6 months, they both completely wiped out, at the time, tens of thousands of dollars of credit card debt. Just literally rebuilt the businesses overnight, which again, seemed genius to me. I'm like,
yeah,
holy crap, we did some other stuff with the chamber and you found out a bunch of people wanted jobs too. So we created employment newsletter and all kinds of crap, being an entrepreneur at the time. And then I've always just been involved in marketing since then, marketed a landscaping business, all kinds of stuff.
So, you figure out about direct response ads. When were you first able to apply it?
Really, when we put that letter together was the first time that, I took all that knowledge basically that I'd learned from the self-addressed envelopes from the back of the National Enquirer. It just kind of stuck me. And I realized that my parents were really big about not necessarily going to college, right? Because they weren't wound up about going to college. It's not like they discouraged it. Nobody in our family had ever gone to college. Nobody went to college, right? But it was about using your brain instead of your brawn, right? That was the big thing. They were laborers, right? Always been. My dad was a truck driver before he worked in the factory. Eventually worked his way up to, assistant plant manager of a factory of 600 people. And here's the guy that went to 6th grade education.
Yeah.
And he did it through sheer drive and determination and knowledge, right? He was super smart, right? Street smart, more so than book smart. But he saw all of us kids, we're all doing something now that uses our brain, all 4 of us, right?
Right.
And we all at one point worked in the factory and we all at one point, we know how to work hard, right? But it was always about working smarter, not harder. And so those lessons just stuck with me, right? Those letters, helping those guys get out of debt. So then in 19, my brother needed to make extra money. He now had 2 kids in his early 20s. And so we started a landscaping business. We're like, what the hell? Like, let's start a landscaping business. And I'm like, hey, I can market it.
Every kid starts a landscaping business at some point.
It was really cool though, because when you spend your own money, right? When you're spending your own dollars and your own dimes, right? Those lessons stick with you, right? They stick way harder. Emotional learnings are way better than intellectual or book learnings. And right off the bat, we said, here's what we're going to do in order to jumpstart this thing, right? We'll create 100 mailing pieces and we literally will go around and the best part of town, all the people that we know were using landscaping businesses, right? Because they had great lawns. And we would advertise those, right? We'd spend our first $100 basically advertising to those guys. And we got 0 calls. And I'm like, well, this doesn't make any sense, right? They're using a landscaping service.
Yeah.
Like, why would they not call us? And it turns out, well, they already had somebody they were happy with. They weren't looking to change. And that type of lesson at 19, you find out in any consumer base of 100 people, there's only usually 3 to 5 that are disgruntled at any point in time.
Right.
You're really banking on finding those guys immediately. And who knows, maybe they called and we didn't answer the phone because back then that's how it worked. So we're like, well, that was a crash and burn. So now what are we going to do? Right. So then we went after the part of town that from the real estate days and knowing working with the Chamber of Commerce, I also knew that every title company has the address of everybody that lives in town. And in the West Coast, we use title companies. East Coast, they use attorneys. But in the West Coast, we use title companies and you can go down for a price and work with that title company and get everybody that doesn't live in town, right? So in our case, we went after everybody that owned a house, but didn't live in that house. And that turned out to be a gold mine because those guys were always looking for somebody better and cheaper or whatever than the vendor they had. Because number one, they couldn't do it themselves, or number two, they weren't local enough to deal with it. And nobody else was contacting them in the mail.
Right.
But that was kind of the aha for us as we're like, hey, this one didn't work. Okay, well, shit, why didn't it work? Readjust and go to the other way. And I learned that stuff early on, that feedback loop in direct response.
So naturally from there, you became a world-renowned marketer at 20 years old. So you apply direct response marketing. You then go on and take a detour, serve our country in the Navy for 14 or so years, and have 2 young boys while you're at it. 14 years is a long time to kind of not be in a profession, essentially. Not that maybe you weren't looking at it, but it wasn't your primary focus. So you go into the Navy, you do all that, and then you retire, right? You're now out of the Navy. What's it like having kind of that, I don't want to call it a safety net, right? But like the known, now you got to go out and figure out what you're going to do next.
Yeah, that was the route that we took in order to get out of the service, right? So go in the service, get out of town. The main reason why I joined, right, I enlisted, was because at the time I was working for the Arizona Highway Patrol as a trainee and trying to go to college. And I'm like, I'm never going to accomplish this. And so I'm like, do I really want to go to college? I don't want to work at a factory job. I loved actually being a highway patrolman, or I was still an officer trainee technically, right? Still in the training program because it wasn't 21, but I loved it. I was around that, but I was in the same town I grew up in, had been there since the second grade, right? It was just one of those things. Anybody that made a name or anything for themselves left town. That was just the way it is. You either left or you eventually end up working at the factory, making $50,000 a year max.
You were what? Born into depression, right? You were.
Yeah, exactly. I'm 800 years old. Me and Noah, we're hanging out together.
Yeah.
Like, I can tell you some stories.
How many people did Moses get on that ark?
Exactly. But it was one of those things where I knew that was my way out of town. I knew that was it. And ironically, I was a kid who absolutely despised change. Military is one way to break that, right? I decided I'm going to enlist. I enlist in the Nuke program.
All right, hold on. I want to backtrack because I know you don't like bragging about yourself, but I didn't find out about this until I was, almost old enough to drive. But you didn't just enlist in the Navy, right? You went and you took the ASVAB and scored, I can't remember what it is because you never talk about it, whether it was top in the city or whatever. But essentially, you scored high enough. If I recall correctly, essentially it was like, well, you pick what job you want, right?
Yeah, I did. I did really well on it. And, when it came to that type stuff, right? When it comes to book learning or school learning or whatever, I excel at that. I have no problem with that. I can put stuff in short-term memory for a very short time. Numbers and facts stick with me, like marketing math sticks with me for whatever reason. I very much related when I heard Warren Buffett once quote, he's like, if I was born 100 years prior to where I was born, I'd have been screwed, right? Because he's like, my brain works really well in this time and in this period, right? Mine works really well for marketing. It's why I actually like marketing better than copy, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, so I did do really well. But that part, book learning, I never had any problem with. And in fact, most of the time growing up, it was about, your parents try to take your strengths and weaknesses and mold you into a better individual, right? That's their job. If they're a great parent, that's their job. And my mom and dad all the time were trying to take the book smarts and turn it into street smarts because both of them were really street smart and understood that stuff. And they're like, if you don't take that knowledge and turn it into common sense knowledge, you're going to get screwed, right? We know all kinds of smart people that can't function in the world.
Yep.
And so anyways, I take off and I go to Nuke School. My whole point of going was to join so I get out of town, save up money for the GI Bill, and go off to college, right? That was my whole point. So I ended up in Nuke School, go through, did really well. And as I'm going through the program, right, talk about meeting some smart ass freaking guys, right?
Yeah.
Like there's some
you have to be
guys.
A smart person for them to say, hey, you know what we trust you with? A nuclear submarine.
I mean, some of the guys I was really good friends with. And I was older because I was about 3 years older when I enlisted compared to when the average 19-year-old kid in Nuke School is. And some of the guys that I went to school with, one went to MIT on a full ride scholarship. I mean, just talk about brilliant guys.
Yeah.
Anyways, end up at Nuke School, get through that right before I go off and they decide to send me off to college. So go to college, do all those things. But all the time, I'm still studying marketing. I took some marketing classes in college and understand they're a bunch of shit, right? Like that's not marketing to me. Brand building is not what I call marketing. And ultimately, the whole reason why I ended up in college and went through college in the end was because in order to be an officer in the Navy, you had to go to college.
Yeah. And I hear they make $1 or $2 more.
Yeah, they do. The Air Force, you chose what major you were, and then they decided whether they were going to give you a scholarship or not so that you could take that major, right? The Navy didn't give a shit. They're like, take whatever you want. Like, I think I started out at mechanical, then went to electrical engineering. And then when your brother came along, I'm like, this is not going to work. So then I switched over to business and accounting. mostly because I had an aptitude for it. Turns out one of the greatest things that you can take. I didn't understand these guys are in the entrepreneurship program. I'm like, the hell is that?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
it doesn't make any sense to me. Like,
Was that even a word back then?
yeah, you're going to listen to a college professor explain to you how you can go be an entrepreneur. Like,
yeah,
just go do it. It'd make a hell of a lot more sense. But anyways, went through college. But while doing all this stuff, I was always still interested, right? My grandpa was a small business owner. My brother was doing stuff on the side, and I was helping him market. At the time, he had an IT business, helping him market the IT business. And then eventually go through flight school as a navigator, naval flight officer, they call him in the Navy. Eventually ended up in Oak Harbor right around 9/11, right? I was in before 9/11.
Yeah.
And that went down and spent a bunch of time, obviously deployed right after that and decided, hey, there's got to be a better way to make a living.
Yeah. Hard to do as a family, 6 months on.
Mine were supposed to be 3 months deployed, technically because of what I was on, an EP3 for all you guys that care, right? I was supposed to be 2 months deployed, 3 months at home.
Yeah.
And it clearly never works like that.
As soon as you have someone who's competent, naturally the workload increases.
That's what happens. Military is no different than anything else. The good ones get rode because that's who the managers are using. In our case, that's all about rank, right? But the department heads are using the good ones in order to rank themselves higher so that they could become CEOs. It's the same path, right?
Yeah.
The guys that are ship bags don't do anything. And it's amazing because everybody's like, wow, the military is not really real life. I'm telling you, it's the same friggin' thing. It's wild when, for me, people struggle to take their military and apply it into the real world. And I'm like, it's the same thing. You're probably not going to go undo a bomb, right? I'm not going to go spy on a country, right? Like, that's what I did. There's not a whole lot of that.
Yeah.
Unless you want to go live in DC.
The taking that and applying that to the real world, it's not like you had a pension to fall back on. Like, you chose for your military career to end, right? Yep. And to move on to the next thing. And I think that's one of the coolest things we always talk about. When you have options, you have power, right?
Exactly. One of my early mentors out of Austin, Texas used to say, one thing is slavery, 2 is a dilemma, and 3 is a choice, right?
Right.
And I've constantly focused on that, right? You set yourself up, give yourself as many options as possible. Choices provide power because then they allow you to truly determine what you want to do in life. I'm reading Arnold Schwarzenegger's book. He talks about when he wanted to switch over from being a power lifter to a movie star.
Right.
He's like, the number one thing that he learned from guys that ended up taking a bunch of bit parts is like, well, they had to pay the rent. So he's like, holy shit, I'll buy an apartment building. That way somebody else pays my rent. And then I can focus on the things I want to focus on. And it provided choices to himself, right? Where other people had to take whatever. He's like, if I hadn't taken that advice and gone down that route, I'd have been stuck just like they were, taking bit parts here or there.
Obviously, I won't say all of the offers you got, but when, you started floating, you were looking to get out, like, you got some crazy offers to stay in, right? Like, they were giving you stuff that, like, people dream opportunities, and you walked away. Obviously, it all sounds cool until you apply reality. Now that I'm a father, right, I can appreciate a lot more. When I was a kid, I was like, how could you say no to that, right? And then you realize, like, hey, when you have young kids, like, there's just a certain risk level to being in the military, and what that looked like was very different based on each thing. But, for you, it didn't make sense. So what was the next thing for you? Did you just immediately know what you were going to do? Did you kind of dabble in a couple things?
The answer is we didn't know immediately what we were going to do, right? We're like, okay, we need to come up with another plan, right? There's 1,000 ways to make money. Let's find a different one. And we're in Colorado at the time, early 2000s. And we had bought a few houses in the late 90s, early 90s, and mid to late 90s. And we're entrepreneurs by nature, your mom and I. And so we're like, why don't we just start a real estate business? Sounds good. Let's find the best guy we can, learn how to do it. And I'm like, yeah, we can't do rental properties because they take 7 years to break even. And we don't have 7 years, right? I got to get out in 3 years.
Right.
And so what are we going to do? So we started buying houses, right? Every way possible. So owner financing, going out and buying them, fix and flips, however you want to say it. And at one point we owned 50 houses. And what I realized in that is we kind of teamed up and we split the things up. Like your mom loved handling the office and doing all that stuff. But for me, what I really loved is the marketing. I'm like, yeah, it was fun, right? Because most of the time I didn't buy a house off the MLS. I almost always bought it directly from the homeowner. I knew my old days that I could go down to the title company and get people that didn't live in the house anymore, and I could have more of a target market, and I knew that, again, the most powerful thing to me was putting words on paper and having people actually give you money for them. It was awesome. And so that's what I did. I'm like, okay, I'm going to focus on the marketing side of things. I'll focus on the leverage side of things, and we'll go down that route. And that worked out awesome. We got out of the service in 2004. Our houses were all built on cash flow. They weren't designed for appreciation. The idea was to hold these things for 7 to 10 years, an owner financing style model. And then, of course, the run up in 2005 and 6 happens. The thing goes nuts, right? The value that we brought into homeowners and doing it didn't really work anymore. By 2008, we were almost completely out of everything because it just didn't make sense. You couldn't buy houses for what they were doing.
You were upside down before you ever got in it.
Yeah, it was amazing, right? All these guys are buying for appreciation, which is the stupidest reason in the world to buy a piece of property. That's not what you buy it
depends, right? Like if you have enough money where you don't need to, be in a position to pull money out of that house for 10 years, great. Like you can afford that. But for hey, this is how we bring home money every month, you can't just delay bringing home money for 120 months and be like, don't worry, like we'll eat eventually.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, I remember seeing an article, and obviously, like I said, emotional learnings are much deeper than real learnings. And when you're doing it, right, you're spending your own money on payroll. Want to be an entrepreneur, spend your own money on a payroll, right? Figure it out. But there was a great lesson that I learned in that time period is that I was focused on cash flow property. Like that was it. I didn't care about appreciation. I didn't care about this. Turned down a bunch of deals that the cash flow didn't make sense, which is fine. Except for, that's like showing up and the only tool you got's a hammer and you're like, hey, I need to turn this screw. Well, I got a hammer. Let's hit the shit out of it. Yeah. Or nope, can't do it. It really taught me that, hey, to have a bunch more tools in your tool belt. These guys were going down and they'd go stand in line and buy properties that hadn't been built yet and flip them to a California investor for 30 or 50 grand before and let them worry about the building part of it. Right. And, the whole time I'm like, this is the stupidest thing ever. Well, the reality is it was very stupid, but you can make a shitload of money doing it.
Yeah. Right. It turned out to be stupid at a point.
It will.
For a period of time, they probably, were extremely happy about it. And then eventually it stops working.
It's about understanding when it's going to stop working, right? And again, that same mentor that talked about choices, he was involved in real estate back in the 70s and 80s. And he gave us some great advice about when you're going to see the music stop. What are things that you can see that are about to happen that give you a heads up that this is about to occur? And, there was plenty of warning signs. There was plenty of things that people could have seen if they were knowledgeable or they searched it out or figured it out. But when you're in it, right, and you're emotionally in it, right? Most people, emotion goes up and all that goes down, right? And when they're emotionally in it, they need that to work.
Right.
Like it's not about wanting it to work. They need it to work.
Most people are on a monthly basis, right? They need to bring home money every month. They're not looking at it on a long enough time horizon to go like, hold on a sec. But bringing it back to marketing, we talk about looking for the anomalies, right? And just like that in real estate, it's like there were certainly anomalies. Now, not everything meant the whole thing was going to come out from underneath it, right? But you look at anomalies and then you spot another anomaly and then you look at another number. And I think that's big in marketing is looking at anomalies, and not everything's a decision today, but everything's context for tomorrow.
Exactly. And the other thing that I've always kind of focused on marketing is take the emotion out of it. Numbers are just numbers.
Yeah.
Right. And whether it's $1 or whether it's 1% or whether it's multi-millions of dollars or it's billions of dollars, it's just a number, right? If you can take the emotion out of it, which is extremely hard for most people to do, but if you can do that and you can objectively look at numbers as if they're just numbers, right? They tell a story, find out what story they're telling and don't try to lead it to where you want it to be, right? That's the biggest thing that I try to hammer home on marketers, right? The thing that I've taught teams over and over again is like, don't get emotional around the numbers. Just because the CEO needs 2 million at the end of the month, right? Doesn't mean you're going to generate it, for one. And number two, just look at what the numbers are telling you, right? It's going to tell a story and it doesn't really matter what he wants or needs. What really tells you is what you're about to do. And then you can take what you're about to do and then you can tweak it, right? You can spin something up real quick or do something to try to adjust to reach that goal. But don't, get so wound up about the emotion behind it all, because then what happens is you don't make good choices.
You've been listening to Marketing from the Edge podcast. If you want to hear more of our thoughts every week, visit marketingedgepod.com. We'll share more of our very best lessons, thoughts, and strategies for growing a business
as well as some personal stories here from the edge of the world. Invest a couple minutes of your morning and we'll give you the blueprint to growing your business from where it's at today to where you want it to be. That's marketingedgepod.com. If you want to reach out to us directly, feel free to email Cody, C-O-D-Y, at marketingedgepod.com, and you might even get a surprise bonus. Next week, we're continuing the interview of my dad, Jon Alexander, on his secret to success in marketing. We'll dive into how he onboarded and then grew one of the most successful direct marketing businesses ever on the planet.